So the next and perhaps even more important consideration of the Panchang is that of the nakshatras. This is calculated as the moon takes about 27.3 days or so to go around the zodiac, and hence there are 27 nakshatras, and each of them are considered to cover a span of 13 degrees and 20 minutes in its basic calculations. And as noted before, there are 28 for other uses as well. Now, just as the Lord of the Day and the hour are linked to the Sun and the Mars, the nakshatra is linked to the moon and the mind, which is driving our chariot, and Saturn is the ruler here, the ruler of Vayu. As such, they're intimately related to the pranas in our body and how we interpret our sense impressions from the world, since our mind is, essentially filtering in, all these sense impressions, and we're acting through the mind. So it's given great importance in Jyotish. Now, on this level, being lorded by Vayu and Saturn, Saturn is the planet that gives longevity, so it's intimately connected to the health of the Vayu in our body and its proper functioning. Hence, we see here that if it's poorly placed, it can bring disease, death, and ailments that originate from Vayu, due to that linkage with the direction of our mind is taking. Now, basically, if our pranas are good, we are too. But if our mind is bad, the pranas get scattered and everything kind of goes to pot. And that's why in Ayurveda, some of the most important fundamental causes of health are more of a mental and spiritual level, not so much a physical level always, because that's we're getting driven by our mental tendencies. With the nakshatra, therefore, we're talking about longevity and pranas, not general health as related to Vara, the sun. So you can have really good health, but you might not live long. Likewise, you might have, live a very long time, but you might have poor health and problems throughout life, but you just keep going through it. So these two things aren't always related, even though we may tend to think they are within how modern medical science tends to associate them. And basically, when your time has come, it's come. So we can only extend life so much based on this. Now, we see here too in the list, nakshatras can be ordered by their basic indications as well as their own elements. So, the earth element is associated with the first through the fifth nakshatras, and the water, fire, air, and then the ether are associated with the last set of nakshatras, as you can see in this list. Now, since Rahu and Saturn are the rulers of the nakshatra and Vayu, those nakshatras in the Vayu category can create a double impact. So just as we were, going over with the Sun and Mars overlapping with the Vara energy, with the day energy, here the nakshatras in the Vayu category can create a double impact, which can make a somewhat unstable mind in the individual if their nakshatra ruler is not well placed. One can also look to the Rahu and Saturn placements in someone's chart to give some extra information that will be added to this as an overall picture of how this placement is working. Now, the nakshatra the moon is placed in is called your Janma nakshatra, and this is one of the really most important considerations in the horoscope as the mind directs our activities, and will tell us a large extent to how a person perceives and how they interpret and they take in the world, and how they experience the world, which will also have an effect on how they act secondarily. Now, the lagna, the ascendant, will show really a deeper and innate side of a person as well, that it's not as apparent either perhaps to themselves or the world at large, but it's really there if you look at these placements, and it's a basic functioning of the intelligence of the person. So these two nakshatras, the ascendant ruler and the moon nakshatra, should be studied carefully to know what traits are primarily driving someone. And as always, all conjunctions, other placements are going to have some say, and that's, just good Jyotish to be considered. There's no, one-trick ponies here. And that's not to say that, single one-off rules, they can often give clear-cut and, pretty interesting descriptions and accurate descriptions of certain traits in a person. But, there's always more to look at. Now, for a basic start, I've outlined some of the main ideas surrounding nakshatras in the following slides. And you can use this as a primer in and of itself, and it's more than enough for any beginner to get a feel for the basic kind of impulses on the nakshatras. And you can print out the slides, and I've given them here for reference. But if you do want to continue this study, it is best to pick up a book on the nakshatras, as I recommended before, just to get in touch and familiar with their basic functioning, as there's a lot of information to unpack here. As I mentioned, one of my personal favorite introductory texts is Prash Trivedi's, which will get you thoroughly acquainted. And all these basic indications is they actually have a course, so a lot of these basic indications is some basic things they've outlined here, and I find them very, very useful, and why I'm passing them on to you here. It's still a condensed version. So, and one can also extrapolate much more information even from these general listings. And so this can include, you can look at, what sign it's in, and the ruler of that sign, the ruler of the nakshatra itself, what kind of energy that's bringing, the deity of we listed here, which might require some researching on your own part to understand different deities' significance, but it's useful, at least in your own chart, just to see the stories and how they might correspond with you. Will give you a little more taste of Vedic astrology proper. Looking at the pada too, where that's placed, all those overlapping energies will give more details to how the nakshatra is functioning and how things are going to behave. So, for example, Bharani nakshatra, the second nakshatra, it's in a sign of Mars, but it's ruled by the planet Venus. So, in that nakshatra, you see there's a water-fire mix right there between the two, the sign ruler, the nakshatra ruler, which is an explosive energy. And the deity of that nakshatra is Yama, which is the Lord of Death. So this is a very intense and extremist nakshatra, passionate, and these people can get very deep into what they do, and they can totally switch into something until they've exhausted everything else. They get very obsessed. So, for example, I have this as my moon nakshatra, and this is the case. I get very interested in things, and I just I keep digging and digging on them, and I've pursued many different paths, and have come up with a lot of good information. Or someone like Bob Dylan has his moon in this nakshatra as well, and if you ever watch any videos from his early days, he was quite a fiery young man, very intense and dedicated, and like this, we can study different characters to see how it's playing out, and then only one placement of that deeper internal nature, and you would never be able to tell a lot of this based just looking at me or knowing me on an outer public level, and that gets into play with my ascendant Scorpio and a lot of other things, but nonetheless, it's definitely there. Now, while this Bharani is kind of the heart of the Aries nakshatra, so it brings up some of that energy. Other nakshatras might shift a little more, so some nakshatras cross over into, and they span two different signs. So some of the padas of one nakshatra will be in one sign, and some of the padas of another will be in another sign. And so you can see which sign your nakshatra is being placed in, and look at, what of the energy of the signs and those rulers, and how that's playing out with the ruler of the nakshatra itself. And it'll give different shades even within the nakshatra itself. So, once again, there's much to consider. And if this intrigues you, if you find it useful, pick up a text on the subject, start looking into it deeper, and I'm hoping maybe in the future we'll look deeper into the nakshatras and get into some of their more specific uses. So past, these are general descriptions, but just as we look at the Rashi chart, and we'll get into different rules to look at a Rashi chart, even the nakshatras have many different ways to use them in their own way as a whole different system as well, which we're not going to spend too much time here, but definitely something to consider. So, I've just given the slides here, and once again, you can print them out, use these. I'm not going to run down them because it's a lot of information to throw out, and you can the better thing to do is take what's provided and start looking at charts of people and looking up these placements and contemplating how it's working. And I hope it's easy to follow through this method, because it's just an amazing amount of information to try and to hold on to within a short lecture format. So, go through it, take it slowly, and, get what you can from it as you move on. Now, to look back at our example charts, as previously mentioned, we saw that the first chart, we've already talked a little bit about, it has that debilitated moon in the 12th, which has created lots and lots of issues for this native. It's one of the main, despite those malefics on the Kendras, this is one of the key elements in this chart that it has kind of created some troubles in this person's life. It's in the Jeshta Nakshatra, which gives this person some air of authority in what they do, and in her job, she has risen to places of so-called expertise or authority where people come to her for advice. She manages different projects and departments within some of these nonprofit areas, so some of that comes through. In this case, Jesh has given more of an interest as well in her own kind of dark recesses, and she is definitely curious in occult subjects, what's beyond the surface of her existence due to all these sufferings in her life. But many of these problems have also prevented her from going down this path and more positive. So it has turned into a darker kind of inward occult kind of experience, but more of a losing a nature of loss and suffering. So it can go either way with that, but definitely there in that Scorpio Scorpio area. Now, the fact that, once again, it's in a Vayu Nakshatra, as I told before, it brings a great deal of anxiety in this person's life. So there's that double Vayu impact, since the nakshatras are ruled over by Vayu. Once again, this is a Vayu Nakshatra. And so this person has struggled constantly and taken various medications for anxiety, and no end of this has come up in her life that has created some problems. So in this case, we can see some overlaps both in the Rashi and the Panchang, which is once again confirming and giving even more information on these kind of intense aspects. Now, the ruler of this nakshatra is placed in the second house of family, along with Venus, which gives a tremendous amount of rajas within that area, and is an area where many problems have stemmed from this in the form of abuse due to that excess of rajas. The rajas energy is difficult to tame. Venus here is also in a low degree. It's under 1 degree. So anytime a planet's in that low degree, which is a specific dosha, specific area of the chart, which is troublesome, can create issues. And the issues for here, and of that house, as well as the significations of this planet. And as we mentioned earlier, there was abuse within the family, second house family, within the early life coming up, which is where a lot of that emotional instability has come up with, and she actually had a falling out with her mother, because the mother stood by and watched a lot of this happen. So a lot of that links back to that debilitated moon. So you see here how the Jyotish really shows the connections between how things happen in our life. In the second chart, we see that the nakshatra is Purva, which is another Vayu nakshatra. While the problems are not as apparent in this native, she does have an extremely fleeting mind. If you talk to her, and when you're talking, she'll jump from one interest to next in a conversation, and it really leaves her rather ungrounded and somewhat of an unintegrated personality. Despite being, successful outwardly and applying herself in the world, she is very creative because of this as well, and has a very creative mind and can work things differently. But she can fluctuate between, being aggressive in a conversation to being passive, depending on which way the wind is blowing, and which is, again, another kind of Purva Ashadha trait. Now, the 6th house placement of this moon with Ketu shows there is some difficulties with the mental, emotional nature. This native has also suffered from depression during times in her life and has many variegated mood swings, to the extent that some people think she's mildly crazy at times. She can get very vindictive and, snap. The Ketu creates very sudden kind of activity. So, everything can seem to be going well, and then something can just break depending on what's happening and kick up this anxiety. Now, the ruler of this is Venus, which is in the 7th house. And this has brought some intense desire as well as a multitude of relationships within her life. So she's a very sensuous person. Venus in the 7th house any times will bring, this plenty of relationships there. It's actually not a most ideal planet for placement to be in for Venus, even though you would think Venus in the house of relationships is good, not always. And this is linked to that mind, which is directing our prana, our energies, our how we take in the world. And so this has been a predominating force of where her energies have gone within this life. Now, her Venus is in Capricorn, which is interesting because it also makes a person very hardworking. Capricorn is a very hardworking sign. And so this makes a person very giving into relationships. So this person has tended to completely give herself over to her partners. And this has created a lot of emotional upheavals in her life because of this. However, once again, we see some blessings as she has been in some long standing relationships for many years despite these fluctuations. However, marriage is still not on the table with this for a lot of reasons, which we're going to look at when we get into the Tithi, which has more to do and gives us more of a shade on how our personal relationships are working. Now, the Tithi is calculated based on the distance of the sun and moon and how they move from each other. And this can be seen visibly within the waxing and the waning of the moon. And this gives us our lunar months with 15 Tithis of waxing half, where the moon is getting brighter, which is also called Shukla Paksha within the Indian system. And then there's the 15 Tithis of the waning half, which is called Krishna Paksha. And important terms to get used to: Shukla Paksha, Krishna Paksha, within the Panchang. Now, as a general thumb rule, the moon is considered strong when it is roughly within 4 Tithis before or after a full moon. Some say 5, somewhere in there. But generally, the closer to the full moon it is, the stronger the moon. And, there's some variations on that, but that's a good general thumb rule. When the moon gets closer to being a new moon, when it's completely dark in the sky, the new moon is called Amavasya. And especially a new moon, that's really considered a weak moon. And it's associated with lots of different issues within the chart as well. Whereas a full moon is called Purnima, where the moon is at its max strength. Now, each Tithi is roughly 12 degrees, and this is calculated by subtracting the sun's longitude from the moon, and then you divide by 12, and that's going to give you a Tithi number. And this is basic astrology, and you can find this most places if you want to get into the calculations. But on a slightly deeper level, we can see that this subtracting of the longitudes is much in reference to this Anga, which has to do with relationships, which is always in the Vedic system, it's a give and take affair, and hence we get this designation. Now, the Tithi refers to the water element, and hence, marital relations, passion, love life, and more close, intimate relations. The nature of those, the basic nature, the basic impulse a person has in that coming into this life, as well as other concerns like our devotion and our, how we relate to our children, comes from this as well. Now, to know each Tithi, we must once again, you can look into their deity, which is also linked up with the nakshatra deity as well, and knowing this can also help us use the nakshatras a little more deeply. But in this chart I've given, you can see that each Tithi also aligns with a certain element, and it can have various names, including Nanda, Bajra, Jaya, Rikta, Purna. And these various tithis have different levels of auspiciousness, which we'll use in Muhurta. But here we want to look at the elements per the different tithis, which will give us a baseline for our interactions and personal relationships. Much like we looked at Vara and Nakshatra, where we looked at them from an elemental nature. So, for example, here, if someone is born in a Rikta Tithi, there's double water, because Tithi in general is the water element of the Panchang, and the Rikta Tithi is, is the water. It's water tithis, and so this can lead to an overly emotional person who might become too attached in the relationships, which can be problematic if other aspects in the chart don't kind of offset that. If one is born in Nanda Tithi, that's associated with Agni, and it brings in that that Gandanta energy of the fire and water mixing. So the person may engage in kind of more quick, fleeting relationships or more selfish relationships, and it can be really difficult for them to settle down or be happy in a grounded kind of circumstance. If one is born in a Vayu Tithi, then there's, that Vayu is that wind emotion. So the emotions around relationships are getting stirred up more. And these people, they really need some steadiness to counteract those effects, or they feel really insecure with personal relationships and unsure and inadequate within relationships quite often. Now, those born in Prithvi, they seek stable relationships. They want, grounding. They want earth. That's what they want out of a relationship. Someone solid. And then Akash person seeks protective relationships. They want someone who will protect them, who will be there for them, who will, cover them, so to speak. Now, once again, I've given some simple general indications for people born under these tithis, just like I did with the nakshatras, and this is going to give some kind of basic insight into the effects. And this can take on, once again, different roles, as noted here, that in general, if someone is, but to begin with, one of the general demarcations, which that's quite effective, is if someone's born in Krishna Paksha, they're going to tend to be a little more introverted, a little more private, and have kind of some secret passions that they don't necessarily share openly. And the deeper into Krishna Paksha you get, the more that might be the case. However, if someone's born in Shukla Paksha, which is the bright half of the moon, where the moon's expressing itself, those people are more likely to be more extroverted. They might like people being around them more. They're more friendly, outgoing, social nature, because that's kind of the nature of the moon. So their moon is stronger. It's going to bring more of that energy into their life. And, it's a pretty solid principle you'll find using across charts. As always, it has to be tempered with the rest of it. But you can use that when you look to the different Tithi indications, which is going to give a push or pull, depending on if the Tithi is in the dark half of the moon or the light half of the moon. And once again, you can study these tithis at your own leisure. Take into account the nature of the ruling planet and the deity, just as before, if you want to research any specific tithi. And at the very least, you should look into the stories of the deities surrounding these placements in your chart to see what it's suggesting on a more mythological level for you. And also notice that the degrees are given here, and these correspond to the degrees that each tithi takes place in. during both. I've given both the Krishna and the Shukla Paksha here. So each one has a Tithi on each side. And only the Tithi that changes rulership, which is important to note out, is when we get to Amavasya and Purnima. And there's also some specific issues around these Tithis close to the new moon that we'll discuss later on. Now, looking ahead to some slightly more advanced uses of this knowledge, we can start to discern some interesting things. Unlike Varesha, and this is just to give you a flavor of, some of the more deeper uses, and there's no end of uses for all this knowledge. But here, unlike the Varesha, which is seen with importance to the lagna, to the physical body, the health of the person, this is represented, or this anga, the Tithi anga, has more importance to do with the 7th house of relationships. So to start to see how you relate to your personal relationships past the basics of how your Tithi Lord is placed, you can see the Lord of the Tithi and how it relates to the ruler of the 7th house, as well as any planets placed in the 7th. So what's that connection between your Tithi Lord and the 7th Lord? Just as a basic, you can look at the planetary relationship charts to see how they're combining. So if it's good, then it's positive, but if not, it can really create some conflict there in your basic. It's your basic general approach to relationships. Another thing to nuance this understanding of the basic Tithi energy, and this is based on some other principles, which gets more into Jaimini understandings, a little more advanced, which is a little too complicated for this intro stage. But the basic is that the 5th house is considered to be the natural house of the Tithi, because of it's the natural house of Jala, of water. And this can be really good if your Tithi Lord is placed in that 5th house, which is the natural Tithi house. If your Tithi is there, then it shows you'll stand by your spouse, for better or for worse. Even if you're standing by your spouse, it can be in a tricky relationship. I was just looking at a chart today. The person, they can't, they can't connect with their spouse at all anymore, but they're still staying in the relationship, staying side by side with them for the children, which was once again another 5th house indication. This person is not letting go, and it's a Saturn placement retrograde, all sorts of tricky things, but it can play out that way. Now, we can also use this idea of the 5th house as the seat of the water element and the seat of the Tithi, and we can count to the house where the Lord of the Tithi is placed in. So, for example, if the Lord of the Tithi is placed in the 7th house, we would count from the 5th to the 7th house, 5, 6, 7, which would give us 3, which is, a 3rd house placement. So it shows some 3rd house things coming up in the relationship. So, 3rd house is a parakrama house. It's a mild Dushtana house, which has to do with fighting and things. So it can bring some Martian energy, some Mars energy into the relationship. So the basic attitude of the relationship can be seen from that way, and as well as what the Lord is. So if the Lord was the moon there, then the moon is always a fluctuating planet, so it may give a little more emotional tinge onto the relationship. If Mars is there, it might bring a little more aggressive and controlling nature, and versus other normal indications of the planet. So this modifies it. Now, by the same token, with that same kind of rule, we can count from the 5th house to where the Tithi Lord is placed, and it also tells us what a person needs to do to improve the relations. So if it's the 3rd house, once again, then it's communication that's key for that person. If it's the 9th house, so if we count from the 5th to where the Tithi Lord is placed, and we get the 9th house, then 9th house has to do, with spirituality or undertaking some kind of learning, and doing those types of things will help keep your relationship healthy. And I've given some other indications here for some basics just to reflect upon, which you can use in your own chart and your own life to kind of see, if you're in a personal relationship, what might help bring you closer together or mitigate their problems based on your own personal personal experiences. A key point here is that the remedies at the Panchang level are very important, and they can actually go a long way, even though that seems like a very simple thing, talk more with your spouse. This is really the base of the rest of the chart. So a lot of other things may fail if these fundamental issues aren't resolved first, much like if we're not, doing yama niyama in yoga, other things won't resolve some easier later. So along with this, there's two is most important is that another important principle is that whenever Jupiter or Venus conjoins any lord of the Panchanga, so any lord of any of these limbs for you, if Jupiter or Venus is with that lord or aspecting it in some way, conjunction's always stronger, but even if it's aspecting, it can bring some blessings in that area of life. So even if though some things seem problematic, if Jupiter Venus is having some impact, some good will generally come as a general thumb rule. So something to keep in mind as well, a really important point. Once again, back to our sample charts. In both of these charts, we can see that the Tithi is the same, and this is namely Krishna Navami, which is ruled by the sun. This gives a strong nature to get caught up in inner struggles for the nature. They get caught up in the inner life of the relationship, and this could really lead to negative or angered behavior, which we've already spoken of before in the second chart, and it's reinforced with this placement, and also some negativity has come in with the first chart as well, where the person internalized, the abuse and so forth, which left to lots of inner negativities, not eating, all sorts of problematic food issues. So in the first chart, we can see that the sun is in the third house, and this is the house of Matuna, or sexual relations. It's ruled by Rahu and Saturn, which are very tamasic planet, and Rahu placed in the seventh will bring unusual relationships as well as ones that kind of cross boundaries. They cross some significant boundaries, and Saturn with Mars over there too, another heavily tamasic placement for this ruler. Now this person has worked as a high-class prostitute with older gentlemen, which can be seen with that Saturn in the 10th as well, and this Rahu in the 7th, giving that really unhealthy relationships with the personal matters with this Tithi Lord. However, the sun here is aspecting its own house, and it's a strong 7th aspect in the 9th house of Dharma. And so this person, they've long desired, a straight and stable relationship, and it's something they really want out of their life. And it's just all these other things have always somehow come up and destabilized it for one reason or another. And this will likely come up within her sun period, which is going to happen a little later, as that energy will come, that sun energy will come to the forefront. And the sun is a sattvic planet. It's just in a tricky place here with that house, with those rulerships. Jupiter is also aspecting here by both Rashi and Graha Drishti, giving once again some blessing to that overall attitude in the relationships. And it's interesting, her clients too in that previous field happen to be, generally educated professor types and older gentlemen, which is a very Jupiterian thing. But either way, she still hopes to too bring in some Jupiter influence, which is the male, and have a family at some time as well. So all those indications are showing up there. So life is complicated. Jyotish shows this, but it shows those influences. Now this is a Jala Tithi as well, bringing in excessive emotion and neediness in her relations once again, which is heavily in her case, as well as the second chart. And her neediness is it's in her personal friendships as well as her more romantic indications, which is a heavy thing on a lot of people, since she has a lot that she's dealing with, and it's created issues in her life. and this heavy Jala influence, that double Jala Tithi, is in the second chart as well. And this person, as I've mentioned before, becomes very attached to their person. With her, the sun is placed in a nice sattvic and dreamy sign of Pisces in that ninth house of Dharma. So she has a little more sattvic energy coming with that Jupiter ruled sign in a natural way. And people with a strong Pisces energy in relationship can tend to get strongly attached and devoted to their partners as well, in a very negative way, to where they lose their identity often. And this is part of the thing that's happened with this person as well. And at her core, she also has this over idealistic kind of romantic need for that relationship at the core. However, both the heavy Venus in the seventh, as we talked about, as well as Mars and Saturn aspecting here from the third house, once again of Matuna, that sexual house, is bringing a very, very large amount of tamas and a very strong physical and sexual energy on this placement, which has brought some less than noble partners, if you will, and kind of squashed that true kind of spiritual, dreamy relationship that she's also always striving for, but always wondering why she can't quite get it. And this is not to mention that Mars and Saturn, as well as Rahu and Ketu, also have Rashi Drishti on this house. So it's really blemishing an otherwise decent placement. Now, Jupiter, once again, is the lord of this, and it's also in the house of happiness, that fourth house, and domestic life, along with the Upapada Lagna, which is a marriage point in this chart, and showing that strong desire to really settle down and be involved in a serious relationship, which she has managed through this, kind of strong sexuality and, many different hiccups she's brought with it to these kind of quote unquote darker kind of seedy-ish partners. So next we're going to look at the Karana. And the Karana is simply a Tithi divided into two halves of 6 degrees, with each being a Karana. So this is essentially the child of the Tithi. So much like in the mythologies, if you read up on them, Mercury is the child of the moon in Vedic astrology. And that's what we can see here too on a certain level. And it shows us too how the desire of the Tithi is achieved, how we go about our actions in the world. And it's related to the earth element, which is ruled by Mercury, and hence it's associated with work and the karma we do in the world, or specific actions we take leading to success in our endeavors. It also relates to concerns found in the root chakra, as it's a very material and actions performed in here, which could be good or bad, depending. So before looking at, the 10th house of work or the D10 chart or whatever, this gives us a really good basis to start from approaching the chart in more details about, what specific careers or paths the person might pursue. It should be noticed that particularly in this day and age, finding a suitable career path, it's really becoming more and more nuanced and kind of difficult to see an exact job description, just for how people are changing jobs so much nowadays, and career paths, studying so many different things and bringing together so many ideas. But it's through the planets that'll give us kind of general ideas for the core talents that this person has that they can work on, to focus a little more in such a kind of a mitigated world. But there are many other indications that alter this, so it's one of the more tricky Panchanga limbs to get around. But basically there's 4 fixed karanas, and they cover the second half, Krishna Chaturdashi, Amavasya, and the first half of Shukla Pratipad. So that's that new moon combination. Those are the fixed karanas, and they can be difficult karanas. And some traditions vary the rulership on these karanas, which you might have printed in the in your little handout I made in the previous unit. But for our purposes here, as our basic look, we're gonna we're going to begin with taking them as Rahu and Ketu ruled, which can show, negative and past life karma coming up due to this difficult moon placement. And all these karanas fall, once again, in the surrounding new moon. So they can bring that double difficulty because, that's not only a difficult Tithi, it's also a difficult Karana. So right there you have two limbs of the Panchang that are kind of tricky to deal with, which is a lot. So as a result, when there is more of this negative karanas in action, the person may feel a lack of support from that earth element, so they don't feel as grounded, as connected to their work in the world, and they may feel like they're kind of moving about, not really doing much of anything, when they may in fact be doing a lot. Now, past these 4 fixed karanas, there's 7 other karanas which are considered to be movable based on the Shukla Paksha scheme. And these start with the Bhava Karana on the second half of Shukla Paksha, that Shukla Pratipad. And you can see this on the top list. And this repeats in order until the fixed karanas come up with the at the new moon. So even though they're movable, they just keep repeating over and over, starting from the second half of Pratipad until we get to that new moon when we see the fixed karanas, and then this starts up. So that's the general scheme of them. Important to keep in mind on this general outline. Now, each of these movable karanas are associated with a different planet, and depending on which one rules your karana, it has a strong say on your approach to work, and based on that planet, it gives its general indications. This is once again modified by its specific placement in your own chart, but you can use the list I given here as a starting point. One should also note that the profession and skills associated with this lord, or any planets conjoining or aspecting this lord, can also have a strong influence on your work in this world for whatever kind of directions you may go for. So you have to see all those influences before making a judgment call. And we're just going to touch briefly here. We'll look at our example charts because we have a lot to get through. But once again, in both of these charts, we can see that the Lord is Jupiter for the Karana. However, looking at the specific chart, we see different ways. In the first chart, Jupiter is in the 11th house, once again, of organization, groups of friends, a house which it's also Karaka for, and it's also strongly tied to that to the Vara Lord, giving this person a stronger foothold with the native and those higher Jupiterian aims. So we saw that before, how Jupiter, or it was the Hora Lord, we were talking how, it's how this person applies it. It's also their energy in life. It also links up with their work, which gives it a stronger impulse behind it and a stronger energy for that person to do that, because it's more innate to how they express their energy. Now, this ruler of here is Venus, and it's gone to the second house of family, and once again this person has done much working on housing for, and remember that Venus is in the low degree, so she's dealing with low-income families, homeless youth, problematic people with Venus issues, with home issues, with family issues, and you can see this coming up within the work and her work in the world. In the second chart, we see Jupiter is placed in the 4th house, which 4th house has to do, with domestic comforts and pleasure. And once again, the ruler is Venus, but hers has gone to the 7th house, which is business partnerships. And, so there's more of an indulgent nature in this Jupiter and this Venus. It's not as altruistic as the first chart. This Venus is in the Kali Yuga Rasha of Capricorn. So it shows, this Jupiter being more concerned with money, with business, with kind of the more lower Jupiterian aims of wealth and so forth. And, stockpiling, that kind of thing. So it's an interesting thing to note that also that this person has actually done a yoga teacher training. So even though, and tried, kind of the yoga thing, but, they couldn't really dedicate themselves to it as much because they were making lots of money otherwise. And And it likely also has to do with that the parikrama issue of the Mara Saturn retrograde in the third house. But you see too how some of that benevolent kind of Jupiterian energy is still coming through a bit, where she had entertained the idea of doing some yoga stuff on the side as well. And finally, we're coming to the last limb of the Panchang, which is the yoga, and which I'll just briefly introduce here, as we've gone through quite a bit of information and plenty to digest as it is. But the yoga is calculated by adding the sun and moon together and then dividing by 13 degrees and 20 minutes, which gives you the yoga. This can also be found by adding the longitude of the sun and moon, starting from Aries, dividing by 1320, and that'll give you an equal number, and then add one there, it'll give you a nakshatra number, which correlates to yoga in the chart. So there's different ways to calculate all this. But the main idea is that it's about these elements coming together, and the Akash is the element that holds together. So once again, you see the nature of the calculation is reflected in what it's showing us in the chart about ourselves. And since the Akash holds elements together, it can show a union and relationship with people in a more general relations. The company we keep, our general circles, our general, how we connect to the world at large, so to speak, and groups of people. And more importantly, how we feel supported and or nurtured by these interactions. Now, these are tied to the nakshatra, and the 27 are allotted to each yoga wherever it's placed. And this is part of another method of calculation of this specific limb. So there's different calculations that come up with the same thing, but this is where the longitude of the sun and moon is worked with from Pushya Nakshatra, which starts the rulerships of the yogas within this scheme, which we'll show you in the next slide. But in a nutshell, basically, there's good and bad yogas. So if we're born under a bad one, we feel lack of support, while being born under a good one, we might feel blessed and protected. And this is more of an underlying feeling where our connection to the world, and it's not necessarily reflective of how successful we might be in the world. So someone may have made it in this world, but they still might feel like, well, I did this all myself, I'm a self-made man, when that's just not true. We all got something from somewhere. While another person might have very little in their life, but they just feel blessed by their very existence. So it's that frame of mind with that feeling of support. And since Jupiter rules here, its placement itself can harm or help these overall indications as given by the yoga and what it suggests. And this is all going to be tempered as well by the placement of the ruler as given here, and the meaning of each yoga. So I haven't provided too much description, as there's already an overwhelming amount of information I've given for the Panchang, but I've given just some basic translation of each yoga and the name as well as the ruler here. And one can check up the placement of the ruler, get a general meaning for the yoga that they're born under, see if it's bad or good, and kind of see how that's playing out in your experience. Now, in looking a little further at the yoga, as mentioned before, the Yogi planet is figured out. So the Yogi planet is the ruler, but it's figured out by finding the exact degree that the yoga and the ruler of whatever nakshatra is placed at that is the Yogi point or the Yogi planet. So this planet can bring unexpected blessings, it can bring good fortune in someone's chart. If you run a period of that planet, it can bring really great things. Likewise, the ruler of the Rashi of this Yogi planet, it's called the duplicate Yogi, which can bring some protection and some blessings of whatever this planet might be promising. It can aid in that. Along with this idea, there's something called the Avi Yogi, and that's basically the opposite of the Yogi planet in that it brings obstacles. So this is calculated as the ruler of the sixth nakshatra from the Yogi nakshatra, and whatever planet is ruling that nakshatra there. And these are set based on this chart, so it's easy to look them up with this chart here based on your own horoscope. But the main these principles work pretty well if you look across and take everything into consideration. But transits to these areas are really important points. So looking at what planets are currently moving over these different areas can trigger either obstacles or blessings. If the Lagna Lord, the 9th Lord, the 10th Lord is the Yogi planet, that can be really, really good for your chart. But if one of these lords, the Lagna Lord, 9th Lord, 10th Lord, is the Avi Yogi, just likewise, it can be problematic and give you big issues as well. And we won't go into depth on these planets too much in particular, but you also want to pay particular attention to doshas and the timing periods, which can trigger these planets very much in their indications. So, if your sun is your Yogi planet and you're running a sun period, that can be really, really good for you. However, if the sun is your Avi Yogi, that can create some obstacles, some problems within that time period, within that dasha for you. Also, in the advent of relationship matching, if the ascendant ruler is the Yogi planet in relationship matching charts, then this can be a very good sign. So basically, let's say your Yogi planet is in Leo, and Leo is the Lagna of your partner. This is a very strong connection and can be a blessing for you with that partner. However, if your Avi Yogi planet is in Leo and that same partner has a Leo rising, then this can create blocks and obstacles in that relationship that may be very hard to overcome. And you may want to consider that in pursuing that relationship. Now, for our final topic, we're just going to, in this introduction, we're going to just look at various doshas that exist within the Panchang. So just as we have doshas of the body, there are various doshas in Jyotish as well that are considered faults or problematic areas in the chart and the quality of time. Unlike Ayurveda, where the doshas are actually necessary for proper functioning of the body, this is just not the case within Jyotish. In the Panchang, one of the main doshas that can occur is when there are conflicts between two different elements. So when the same planet lords over either water and fire in the Panchang, or if the same planet rules over Vayu or Prithvi, then these are considered problematic because the same planet is ruling over conflicting elements. So Earth is very stable energy, Vayu is a very moving energy. Those conflict. So when a same planet links those, there's a trouble bringing that together. And whatever houses that planet lords can be weakened to a great extent if there's not other mitigating things in the chart from the basic Jyotish principles you've already learned. It's important to note that Akash in Jupiter doesn't have any doshas because it's what brings everything together. So it can have issues. And this once again just shows how much of a blessing Jupiter can be in a chart. And you see this time and time again with all the different indications and how it works out in different people's charts. But this is just one more layer to consider, as this dosha can bring up issues often not seen through regular chart analysis. Another big dosha in the chart is what is called Sanskranti, and this is the first day when the sun enters into a sign. And when this happens, the sun is in the first degree of a sign, and it's considered very weak. So most any planet, and particularly the Lagna too, will also function poorly in a position such as this. However, in our look at the Panchang, when the sun's in that first degree, this makes the Vara Lord, which is associated with sun and vitality, can make that weak in the chart no matter what planet it is. So, even if Buddha is my Vara Lord, if the sun's in Sanskranti, that Buddha can kind of become weaker by association. And once again, all factors of the chart need to be taken into account, but this, can give trouble to a person's health in whatever that Vara Lord is connected to. Per the day of the week too, there's different indications and all these things, but I don't want to overwhelm you with that. But just as a general indication, whenever that planet is in a low degree, take note of it and pay attention to how that's functioning for the person. There's also many other doshas to consider in a chart, as well as being born on a new moon, a nearly new moon, as I mentioned before, specific indications. If family members share the same Janma Nakshatra, there creates some issues within the family for that for those people. Birth on eclipses can create issues, or high spirituality at times too. And then there's also types of Gandanta or junction points, which you've learned. So basically, transitions between those different fire water signs are important Gandanta points, but so is it between the Tithis, between the beginning and ending of Tithi cycles, the nakshatras within the Gandanta points, as well as long Gandanta. All these there's lots of different Gandanta points to look at. But basically, something close to the beginning or end of something is often an unstable energy within a chart. And this gets, all these doshas gets pretty complicated, takes some time to tease out. It's also an area that's easy to get really freaked out when looking at a chart. So we won't go into detail here, but just be aware there is more detail if you want to take this further. The positive side of all this is that there are also remedies given for various issues in the charts that are, beyond just the, common gemstone recommendations. There's various mantras, there's worship of different deities and pujas, donating to different causes, fasting on certain days, and even something as simple as buying more nice clothes to appropriate Venus can be a remedy within Jyotish. For the most part, most remedies, especially gemstones, specific sadhanas, should be handled by a practiced astrologer. But I'm hoping to introduce some basic, practical, safe things that we can do later in the course, just so you get a full scope of Jyotish, how to pick some of the stuff out and how it moves. So that's your introduction whirlwind through the Panchang, and I hope it's been helpful. For those of you who are new to this information, once again, it's a lot to tease out, and I know that, and I've tried to streamline it as much as possible, giving you all the kind of nuts and bolts indications. But I ask you to really pause here, make sure you're familiar with the basics, at least of what each element is, the basics of calculations and how it's derived, because we'll be taking that. And we'll be using some of this information and picking out different days for different activities. And that's Muhurta is a whole nother branch of astrology. And so there's, some details we have to consider there as well. But, I hope this has been useful, and, ask questions and post your own charts and things like that in discussion if you're interested. Namaskar.